Okay, I'm hoping that people can see that now. I'm sorry about that, everyone. Um, can everyone see a paddock now? I'm hoping that you can. Um, Hopefully now you can see a paddock. So I'll just start again because this is a recording that we're going to be having online. So welcome to another 50 Acres Academy webinar. It's something that we do monthly, and as I was saying to people before, it's really just to encourage people to discuss and think about some interesting concepts. Today we're going to be looking at distrust and disruption. It's a concept that a lot of people are thinking about at the moment, and so it's an interesting topic and one that's on the top of mind of a lot of people. As I said, as I was about to say before we had the technical problems, that a lot of there is a client that asked me a couple of weeks ago whether or not um, uh, uh, Pauline Hanson was about to take over control of the Australian government. And I think there's a lot of confusion and fear out there, really, about what this means and what does it mean that people are approaching and really upturning, I suppose, new or old ways of thinking, and they're really putting their sort of finger up to authority in the establishment. And I think a lot of people are confused. Like everyone, I don't have an answer. I suppose I really just wanted to have a discussion about it today. But, and suggest some ways in which we can perhaps tap into some of that distrust and disenfranchisement and work with it rather than necessarily working against it or not knowing how to deal with it. So this is what really today is about. So disruption, how to understand and harness it to communicate effectively is what we're hoping to discuss today, and I'm hoping that we don't have any more technical issues. And please put up any questions that you've got into the box. So what is what is it really? But today, this is what we're going to look at: how are mindsets and cultures changing in a world where disruption and technology is really smashing into each other, and how can organizations and companies be bold and use the conflict and contradiction to their benefit and to connect consumers and stakeholders? How the next generation of digital consumers rejecting what's gone before and what's past, and are now creating a new language, new tribes and ethics and questions, and throw them in as we go, please. And I think I might have said to people on the last webinar, it may have been another discussion that I had, but a couple of weeks ago I was in Melbourne for a meeting, and I was in the cab and I was listening to some people on the radio. It was John Fay interviewing a bunch of kids in Melbourne, and they were media students in year 12, and they were being asked, how do they get their information? And the majority of them were getting their information, their news feeds, from Snapchat. As we know, there's a lot of news organisations that are actually on Snapchat now, and it's an absolute way of getting information from people. They're asked whether or not any of them had bought newspapers, and what was really interesting is only one of the 15 had ever bought a newspaper. He put up his hand and he said, yes, I bought one once for a school project. And so it really is that we're in a very different world. People are getting information in a very different way, and that's what I mean by rejecting what's gone before and creating new language and new way of getting hold of information. And it is in that context of that culture of disruption and disenfranchisement. So what is disruption anyhow? Well, disruption is a form of innovation in many respects. If you look at it positively, it can also be a negative concept, but in terms of how people are using it, the parlance that people are adopting it in is, today's most successful disruptors have shown that it's about efficiency. It's about adopting new thinking and removing a whole lot of things that prevent us from being successful, all the layers of old stuff from the old way of doing things. It takes disruptive thinking, really, if you think about it, to shake up a business model, technology or market, and change behaviours and thought processes. So what really this means in reality is that organisations and corporates where employees are encouraged to share new ideas, participate in brainstorming sessions, and have a diverse set of outside interests that drives their creativity at work. We all know the whole, the myth about at Google, and other some of the other tech firms, where there's whole floors of places to play and hang out, and sleep pods, and you know games to hang out in. I've been to Google; they're a client of mine for a while, and it's true. That's how they do live and they do work. That's not to say they don't work really long hours, because they do that too. But it is an interesting way of working, and I think obviously Google and some of those people were some of the early adopters in approaching it in that way. In some respects, 50 Acres is a disruptor as well. We started out 7 years ago, and we've always been a virtual office. I am going to get an office in Canberra in the next this year, but we do have a completely flexible virtual way of working, and to some people that is not immediately understood, or they can't really comprehend it. But to an increasing number of clients, in fact, the majority now, corporates, men, women, it's something that people don't have an issue with and don't have to grapple with too far to understand it. So everyone's talking about disruption, aren't they? And that's what I was talking about before, about people don't know how to deal with Pauline Hanson. They're not sure about how to comprehend how to manage or respond to a tweeting president of the United States, tweeting rude, abusive president of the United States. But there's a whole lot of issues that are driving it. So if you're looking at the whys behind it globally, well, they're exploiting politicians all over the place. You can point to any number of them: Marie Le Pen in France, Trump in the US and his supporters, One Nation, and other independent groups here in Australia. There is equally resurgence of people are now calling it the alt-right, is another way of describing it, although that's a sort of a pretty formal way of describing the most fully formed right-wing expression of it. But politicians really are exploiting the anxiety about mass migration, refugees and terrorism to gain a support for a number of what are really extreme policies. Populist leaders champion, what are really largely working class interests against bosses, in inverted commas, if you like. If anyone caught Pauline Hanson on the Insiders on the weekend, it was really interesting in the sense that she was talking about, ordinary Australians who are just trying to get on with their lives. And in many respects, it's the same sort of language that Labor has, if you boil it down to its simplest. And so she is attracting some of those sort of unformed thinkers. But what's interesting in recent months, particularly in Australia, is that this resurgence in One Nation since the election initially was taking sort of equal amounts of votes from Labor and the coalition. It seems that it's now taking a lot of support from the coalition, which is obviously of concern to them. Excuse me. So trust in institutions, isn't any longer automatic. Traditional institutions designed to hold society together really have lost their authority, the authority that they certainly once had. And I think that's driving a lot of that disruptive thought processes and responses of the electorate, and moreover the community and communications. Excuse me for my cough. So what's causing the disruption? Well, really, if it boils down to it, it's digital. Business organisations like Airbnb and Uber didn't exist before 2008. It's not that long ago, and then they're now multi-billion-dollar businesses because of just digital disruption. How they've been able to do it? Well, obviously, most of the time, these businesses have become disruptors because of their ability to go digital and disrupt an industry. So on the one hand, we've got the politicians disrupting the political discourse. We have a whole lot of corporates and entrepreneurs disrupting business thinking and the way of doing things on the other hand. So in many respects, things are churning a lot and people are trying to grapple with that. It creates new ways for business to access data and customers. It provides customers with access to new products, information and services. The challenge for organisations, obviously, is how to respond to all of this. So not only the disruptive discourse, but also the disruptive way of doing things. So there's two sides to the disruption, if you like, in terms of the discourse on one level and the way that people are disrupting whole industries on the other. So it's both the thinking and the methods that are being disrupted. So disruption and technology are colliding, and that's what I just was alluding to. There's a vacuum between the old system, which is being disrupted, and a new one that has not yet totally been discovered. Disruption and technology are now colliding really creatively to bring about new thinking. So in the era of disruption, and I think we all know this, we're all trying to work out how many social media platforms we should be on as a company or as a not-for-profit or as an individual. Do I need to be on Snapchat? Does my organization have to be on Instagram? These are all ways of grappling with grabbing hold of this new way of communicating with people, and we're not sure what to do. What we do know is that you need to grab these things and give them a go and try them. And in many respects, the speed to market or grabbing hold of some of these new ways of doing things, making the new ideas happen, isn't just an advantage. It's obviously a survival ploy. So if you're comparing yourself as an organization or as a corporate against someone who is doing, you're grabbing hold of all of these opportunities versus your competitor who is still advertising in the local paper and handing out paper flyers at supermarkets, you might be doing that too, but you're also looking at new ways of communicating and you're probably going to be outstripping your competitor. I spoke to a group of businesses in Goulburn in New South Wales just last week, and it was one of the things that we were dealing with there. Goulburn's a big regional town in New South Wales, and there were 60 or so businesses there, and we were talking about just this. And many of them used to rely on the Goulburn Post, and now they can't do that. And so they're really thinking about how they then grapple with some of this stuff. As local, successful, thriving businesses, how do they now move with the times, if you like? So how can organisations and companies be bold in using this emerging conflict and contradiction to connect with consumers and stakeholders? The backlash mentality, I think, is driven by the current political and cultural tensions that exist across the globe. In the face of this real tumult, if you like, I think organisations and brands are choosing to embrace the negative by taking a stand and being controversial. The next generation of digital consumers are rejecting what's gone before and really creating a whole new language, a whole new way of doing things, I think. So obviously, one of the things that we wanted to get hold of is, some practical thought starters and a toolkit about how we can actually grapple with some of this stuff and deal with it in terms of a communication sense. This is what we were, heading in terms of this discussion today. Some of these ideas, I hope, will help you devise a strategy to navigate disruption in your space. I think one of the things that people could be well advised to do is being direct. People, I don't think, have any longer the time or the patience to digest and interpret messaging that's long or overly complex. It's one of the things that a lot of my clients deal with. How do you express things in a simple way. They're always concerned about what they think is dumbing down a message. I don't think it's dumbing down. It's more about being understood by the majority, more people. It's not about making it, you know, being rendered unintelligible or not without meaning. It's about being able to get through to more people than you could before. And then one of the things that I always say to someone is you can always, someone with a PhD can always understand a simple message. Someone who doesn't have a PhD can't understand necessarily a complex message. And I think it's really important to remember that. That's something that's rung true for a long time, and I think it's very much strengthened by the way people are communicating in recent years. Being straight up, I think less is more in terms of people who are overwhelmed with choice. If you think about your own life, and I know from my perspective, not that long ago, I would, as a journalist, I would linger and read the newspapers that would come into the office each day. When I was in the UK, there were over 20 of them. Here, when I worked in Parliament House in Canberra for Channel 7, there were half a dozen. And we would go through them because we would want to pick up the nuances, we'd want to understand, and that wasn't that long ago. It's just over 10 years ago, and we would, try and understand the nuances and who'd got the leaks and all those sorts of things. And I would have missed if I was still in that job today as political producer at Channel 7, you would have missed about 122 stories in between sitting there and reading the paper and getting on with the day, because I know from my husband, who works in the press gallery, is president of the press gallery, and he and his other colleagues really get a lot of their stories from social media and from gossip, Twitter, Instagram, Twitter a lot, and just from gossip and online. And no longer are newspapers, certainly in the print edition, the vestige of where they were. So I think people need to think about the fact that people are really moving forward. They're getting their information quickly, rapidly. They want an update. They want to get the latest. They want to understand, with that terrorist attack in Paris, 6 people died in the first half hour, but what's happened an hour and a half later? 10 years ago, you'd have to wait, 10 hours to find that information, 24. So, it is about being less is more, so that you can make sure that you are communicating with people who are overwhelmed with information. Cutting corners. I think building direct relationships with people also enable you to build a long-term future with your audience. And that's about having conversations with people. It's about, yes, they're online, and in many respects you don't meet them, but trying to understand them, enter into conversations with them. People say this, but do many people do it? I'm not sure whether they do it really. So it's about trying to see the human through the processes that you're using. So if that's via Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, really trying to, obviously if you saw someone in person, they'd be very different to how you imagine them from an interaction on Twitter or Facebook, but more nonetheless try and really understand them and develop some sort of rapport, I think. Diffusing tension, highlighting misinformation and breaking stereotypes, I think, is a really good thing to do. One of the things that I think people are facing with the online world is that there's a lot of misinformation that can be circulated, fake news, in fact, I should have called it. And I think if we can highlight in our own sectors, in our own organisations, in our own businesses, when there's some information out there that is wrong, I think that helps to empower particularly those in not-for-profit space, the disenfranchised that we're helping. Being transparent is, I think, also really, really helpful. making your organisation and brand's workings public in order to gain the trust and stakeholders and consumers. A couple of months ago, I was dealing with the washout of a story on the ABC, a big story. It was on Four Corners. And I was assisting a client and another client, not a client, but someone in the space I was aware of, decided not to respond in any way to the program, which was probably about a third of the program was focused on what they were doing. And so they didn't respond. They deleted all of the comments from Facebook. They basically wanted to wipe it off. And this is what I mean by being transparent. I'm talking about a crisis here, but I think if people can understand how you think and how you talk and how you function behind the scenes, I think that's helpful. So that's about explaining when there's good things, when there's bad things. That's about illustrating it visually. It's about talking about it in words. Obviously not in a great deal of details, but I think, if you can bring people in to an understanding of what you do and how you think, and social media is a perfect vehicle to be able to help people do that, then I think you then create a community of people who understand a bit about what you do and a bit about what you are. I mean, one of the things that I always do is quite honest about how we work. I think a lot of people know that I live on a property, et cetera, et cetera. People don't want to know that you got up and made cereal for breakfast, but I think if they can understand a little bit about what makes you, what drives you, I think that's helpful. And I think people really, there's almost an expectation that people want to be part of that. Being real, I think people feel ignored by the brands and organizations that focus on, perfect people and customers. I mean, I think, if you think back a few years ago, people certainly used to want, people would go for stock photos or photos. When they took the photos, things would look staged and lovely. There's definitely a trend to moving away from that and making things look real, warts and all, however you'd like to describe it. But being real, I think, rather than talking about an idealized notion or a sort of a perfect group of customers that you're working with, I think can really help, again, reinforce the fact that we're in a real world, which I think in the context of disruption works better. Being emotional, I think considering the diverse and distinct emotions of each of the target customers that you want to reach is always really good. And by being emotional, it's connecting with people really on a real way. People don't want to be. People want to be, I suppose, acknowledged. They're different. They're not an amorphous group of people that you're dealing with. Either in target groups or in individuals as a sort of a one-on-one. I think it's really important to obviously recognise that in the way you communicate with people, and some of that, those emotions and that real sorts of communication really can wash over everything that you're doing. Expressing personal experience, and I think this is really, people talk about case studies in not-for-profits. A lot of people we're always wanting case studies. And what is a case study? Well, really, it's about personal experience. It's about demonstrating, the fact that, you are dealing with real human beings and that you are helping real human beings to do something, whether you're a company with a service or a product, or whether you're a not-for-profit, you are a real, you're dealing with people, and how is what you're doing, helping people. So I think that's another way of, I suppose, making it real. Allowing people to meet, I think, is also a really good thing. And I think increasingly a lot of organisations and companies are organising face-to-face engagements. One of the things that we've got in the wings is a series of live webinar events or a live podcast or whatever you want to call it, which we're going to start in a month or two, where I'm going to bring people together, first one I think will be in Canberra, and we'll do it at an ice creamery there and have coffee and ice cream, which I think is a nice way of doing it. Um, it's about allowing people to connect. A friend of mine in the UK called Julia Hobsbawm has a networking service or company called uh, Editorial Intelligence, where she organises what she calls curated salons, which is obviously a very European way of describing it, but it is really networking events where people have the opportunity to actually talk and connect. I think we've sort of gone through the digital tunnel, and to some extent it's now just part of what we do, and now people are getting back to realizing that we're actually humans and we need to talk to each other and occasionally look at each other and maybe smell each other's perfume or body odor. I think that's a real it's a real trend. It's really happening. I know that sounds sort of corny. I know people have been meeting all the time, but I think we also can use a lot of online tools. We can use virtual things like a webinar or a chat room or a video conference. But I think most definitely there's a trend where people are now wanting people to get together, whether that's just half a dozen people for a lunch, whether that's some sort of public rally. I follow a lot of podcasts and all sorts of things from the US, and there's increasingly I think in the face of this disruption, certainly in the States and globally, there's certainly a trend to get people out and engaging with one another. And through that, and I'm not talking about protest here, I'm talking about engagement and human contact in the States in certain groups. And the large majority of people, I think, that are going and protesting and coming together. It's obviously they're large scale meetups, but I think allowing people to meet beyond their online selves is certainly helpful in the face of this disruption. I think biting back is also another way of looking at it. There's a new description of it, Gen Viz, or Generation Visual is another way some people are now calling it. I think it's an opportunity for people and organizations and brands to really, suck it up, get a backbone and stand up for who and what they are, and accept that the customer isn't always right. I think, people are able to retort and respond. I mean, I was just listening to ABC TV this morning, and tomorrow is International Women's Day. The ABC are having a women presenters on everything in every place in the country. I think that's what they said, and they were reading out a lot of comments from Twitter and I imagine it was Twitter or Facebook, and there was a lot of aggro. A lot of people they were giving them they were giving them air, but there was a lot of aggro, and I think people are really used to being able to now say what they want. They're shouting out, as we know. Sometimes that verges on the trolling and on online abuse and worse. But I think it's time for us to stand up and manage that and deal with that. And sometimes we have to deal with it in a legal sense. Sometimes we have to deal with it to protect ourselves. But often it's about actually putting forward a view and standing your ground. And I think, apology, sometimes is a default position, but it's not necessarily, you're not necessarily wrong. Sometimes you need to actually just say, no, this is how it is. This is what we do. This is how we're doing it. And if you're confident about why you're doing certain action or activity in a certain way, then do that proudly. Make your point of view your point of difference, I think, rather than recoiling from it. Being counterintuitive on social. And what I mean by that is, obviously don't let Twitter, redefine who, or Facebook or Instagram redefine who and what you are. Always remember that technological advancements are tools. They're not imperatives. So it's about how we use them rather than how we have to use them or how we have to act or have to behave on them. We don't have to put those weird faces on our faces. If we use Snapchat, we can create a group of people and a group of a community on Snapchat without looking weird if we want to. We can put information and do it differently. Brands and organizations can take control and use social media as an editing tool to communicate what they want to do. Listen, I think, to how people use and read and talk about your services or what your organization does, and decide, are they the consumers that you want to attract? Challenge your audience, I think, and make them feel uncomfortable sometimes. If you're a not-for-profit and you are campaigning, there is absolutely the opportunity to challenge norms. Now, sometimes that's scary, sometimes that takes you into a new area and into uncharted territories, and sometimes boards and senior executives and senior staff at organizations don't like the feeling of doing something different and challenging people, but sometimes it's good to do that. People have been doing challenging norms and thinking for hundreds of years. We now have the opportunity to do that in a different way, in a way that moves fast, is immediately accessible, and has the ability to reach far and wide. I think as people engage more openly with social and political topics, brands, organisations can reach consumers or their stakeholders with controversy and with discourse. I think that's really an option that's open to you. So thanks very much to everyone for taking place in with today's webinar. My apologies again for the screen and the fact that we had to stop and start. If anyone's got a question, please jump on now. The next webinar is in April, on April the 11th, and I'm just going to look at the top 10 social media trends, or forecasts, if you like, for social media and where social media is going, that are dominating 2017 and how we can use them. So that's what we're going to cover in the next webinar. Something very practical and very specific, but there's some really interesting developments out there. So it'll be really interesting to cover that, I think. So thanks so much. Someone's just asked me a question. Are any of our clients using Snapchat? Yes, they are. Ones where they are specifically targeting some of the Indigenous organisations that we've worked with, not current clients, but clients that we've worked with in the last year or two. I know a couple of them are on Snapchat and building communities there. It's expensive to advertise on Snapchat. I think it's still prohibitive. When Twitter and Facebook first started, advertising was really costly. But people are using Snapchat. They're building up a community. The problem is with Snapchat is the metrics aren't immediately understood or understandable quite in the way that Twitter and Facebook is. So, you don't actually know. You can have all sorts of connections with people, but you don't really know how many people have seen what you've done. So it's about the amount of people that you have following you, and you can just hope, a bit like anything else. You think you've got stuff out there, but you really don't know how many people are observing it, or if it's reaching anyone meaningfully. So yes, they are. I think it is still used and can be used for a younger audience, from sort of 12 or 15 through to 25, 30. But like a lot of other mediums, Twitter and Facebook, Facebook used to be what younger people were on, not too long ago, and now everyone's on it. It's where the numbers are. It's where the great bulk of people are. So I think Snapchat will become more viable and a broader platform. I think advertising costs will come down there, but I do think there'll be other modes. Just like 15 years ago, Twitter wasn't a word in our vocabulary, neither was Snapchat. In the next 10 or 15 years, there'll be a multiplicity of new platforms. The problem is knowing which ones to use and which ones not to use. And I think it's really ultimately up to people to work out whether or not your community or your tribe or your stakeholders are going to be using a particular platform, and whether you can resource it. Moreover, I think is the most important thing. You need to be able to resource it properly. You can dip your little toe in, and that's not a problem. Um, but to make it effective and work for you, you have to have some sort of regularity about it and content that you push out, and cross-reference and cross-pollinate across your platforms, I think, is another thing that works. People have probably noted that people have Twitter handles now with their Snapchat code, that you can just click onto and go straight through to Snapchat. There's a whole lot of ways you can cross-reference and cross-pollinize on various platforms. So I think, yeah, it's worth having a look at, but advisedly, obviously depends on who you're trying to communicate with. Thanks for that question, Rebecca. Any other questions before we head off? But otherwise, thanks again for joining us today, and I hope you have a great day. And the next time we meet, we'll have a better screen, I would expect. And thanks for staying with us and jumping back onto to the second run through. And sorry about the technical problems. Have a great day, everyone.